artist Ferdinand Brückler. The corridor immersed in the visitor with the array of various forms of experimentation from the early 20th century, when the visual and textual merged together. So in other words, it can be read, or it can be interpreted also as a corridor of distinct formats and strategies of the joyful possibilities and impossibilities which this interpersonal communication can display. All of the works appropriated the visual, graphic, and auditory mediums. So we have all those qualities which we traditionally associate the poetry with, yet there are the objects, artifacts, which were also visual ones. The two spaces were juxtaposed, were put together. One is corridor, where I would find a metaphor between a contemporary world and the position of a man in a contemporary world. When we think about what today the world is, or what our age is about, we think about the age which is affected with the rise of visual culture and its prominence in the everyday life. Whether we think about photography, film, internet, our mind is bombarded with images, words that are incorporated in images. And in contrast to a classical place, a reading of poem or poetry had, where reading of a poem required a certain focus, concentration. This contemporary space is very fluid, changeable, it's unstable. And in that way, the corridor in the exhibition provided a direct experience for all that what the world today is. And at the same time, it was a sort of timeline for the experiments with language over the past century. At the end of the corridor, there was a video screened where the performance artist John Giorno read his own piece, and it was accompanied with the sound, not only the sound of his voice, but the sound of the beating heart. So not only literally, but also metaphorically, the thing which you can, it was this place, which you can see in the background of the picture, was as if the heart, the pulsating heart of the exhibition, and then the space opened to a more, to a grander place. I would call it a more classical space for the visual art exhibition, where the works of 12 contemporary American visual artists were displayed. From my experience, but also as the critics say, the bigger space was not that intimate as we could call the corridor space, and sometimes it seemed to me that the works of art didn't come into the mutual dialogue as I would have expected in the exhibition like this. However, there are the two artists I would like to focus on, and I'd like to introduce you to them, who first of all are visual artists, but who incorporate the textual practices into the innate work, and who are somewhere in the borderline between various media. As it is probably clear from what I have been speaking about, the exhibition is based on a kind of tripod of the three elements, and those elements are the characteristic features of the visual poetry. Yes, the visual poetry can be defined through not only a rhetorical device which the words can be involved in the combinations of rhetorical devices as tropos, but the visual poetry depends on the topos, which is the meaning constructed through a certain situatedness of the word, which is shaped by its spatial position. And then also the typos, yes, and it's the typography. And here comes the woman I'm going to talk about. Can you read that? Mm-hmm. Okay. When did we steer so far apart? We used to stand on such common ground. We were in a quandary about the present. It is true, but I thought we were on our way to something new. You said you could see it coming to form. What was it in my last communication that forced you to vanish? I thought, the world seems to be falling apart, but you were the one who told me that change is painful. You said, we have to give up everything we know in order to move forward. Did you expect something different? I might be infected by the tide of the country, but I feel as if we were at the opposite ends of the earth, and I can't see the route to lead us back together. I read another piece, and you could read simultaneously the other one. This is the first one which was introduced in the exhibition, right as a link, as a very timid link between the corridor and the vast space presenting the 12 emerging artists, new artists from the United States. The text is by Sharon Hayes, a contemporary American performance video installation photographer, sound experimentator, her messages, because there were more of them throughout the exhibition, were introduced into the space of the gallery, having nothing whatsoever with the visual art exhibition, except that they were in a visual form, right? They combine, or they can be read as love letters, but also as messages from out of the space. They can, some of them, as you could see from what I was reading, but from what it was on the screen, can have also a certain larger social political connections. At the same time, she had the exhibition in Whitney Museum, which was called "There Is So Much I Want to Say to You," where more openly she, on a basis of performances she recorded in a Manhattan place in front of one of the corporate agencies, she delivered the messages to a lover, but also the commentaries on a political and social situation. I will have to wrap up, and therefore I'm going to say that the other artist I was going to speak about was Adam Pendleton, a young American artist. He's, I think, 28. I don't know how much you can see out of those canvases. He also combines in his works the elements of the politic commentary, the visual representation, the history, and his works are called the series he presented here are called Black Dada. I don't know how much you can see. He draws on the Leroy Jones's poem Black Dada Nihilism from 1964, but at the same time, the context of these paintings is highly visual. He photocopies the structures of a minimalist American artist. Both of them, in one way or another, employ appropriate pre-existing messages, whether in the form of a text or in a visual form. And both of them put together multiple media. And my point was to conclude that this intermediality, which is so present in the contemporary world, is a way how reality somehow appears as if in the gaps between one paradigm and another, and that we find the presence, which otherwise is its presence, which otherwise is elusive, in between those different media. The contemporary Czech philosopher Petříček, the professor at Charles University in Prague, says, I say it first in Czech and then I try to translate, že myslí nepoznáváme dle toho, že se měníme. We recognize that we think because we change. And this fluctuation between one medium and another, and the change of a descriptive pattern into another, is generated in one's mind. And the point I wanted to make is that I believe that the space for poetry is the mind, and that the mind is, and the poetry is the state of mind. As Wallace Stevens in the poem Snowman beautifully expressed, one has to have a mind of winter to regard the frost and the boughs of the pine trees crusted with snow.
Thanks very much, Anna. The third speaker is Eugene Fleischer, who is a homeboy as well, assistant professor at the department here, where he did his PhD also, completed in 2001. In the same year, he was also the recipient of a Fulbright grant to the University of Maryland. His research interests include North American studies, curriculum development, Canadian studies, jazz, blues, poetry translation, both into Czech and English, and creative writing methodology and practice. Eugene's going to be talking about humor in American poetry. There's names such as Ogden Nash and Dorothy Parker will pop up along the way, included as well later in more contemporary poets, Tony Hoagland and Mark Halliday. So over to you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Justin, for the introduction. So, I'll be brief. I chose the topic of humor in American poetry, and I will argue in the following samples, drawing on some serious theory as well, that there is much comic poetry in recent American poetry history, although people may not have been aware of it. So, in a study from 1984 called God Be With the Clown, a minor American poet, who is funny by the way, but I won't quote him, I quote others, argues that the distinction between light verse and serious comic poetry should be made, and that all poetry should not be labeled light verse provided it's funny, meaning Wallace argues for the existence of serious poetry which may be comic, which may be funny, which is yet different from light verse. Drawing on a host of pioneering critics on poetry, he claims there's a comic poetry tradition ranging from Walt Whitman, who most people don't think is funny at all, and Emily Dickinson, who many people will consider funny. There are many examples of her funny self-deprecatory poems, through Wallace Stevens up to more contemporary names such as Tony Hoagland and Campbell McGrath. The problem is how to grasp comic poetry, because most critics, as is usual, they would speak of literature, but they would mean fiction, so they have rather paid attention to comic fiction and drama, and not really to comic poetry. So, Ogden Nash, perhaps the best known light verse American poet of the last century. I give you the first quotation from his famous poem on the chipmunk. You see, the rhyming is fairly. My friends all know that I am shy, but the chipmunk is twice as shy as I. He moves with flickering indecision, like stripes across the television. He's like the shadow of a cloud, or Emily Dickinson read aloud. Okay, so playing around. This is sort of called light verse, so this is not a serious comic poem I was going to describe later on. So light verse like this has not been taken seriously by critics of American poetry. One more example of a famous light verse poet of the last century, Dorothy Parker, and her acerbic suicide poem. Razors pain you, rivers are damp, acid stain you, and drugs cause cramp. Guns are lawful, nooses give, gas smells awful, you might as well live. End of quote. So you see, if the rhyming's too formulaic, too easy, actually Mr. Nash was really a fan of sort of linguistic puns and that kind of thing. It's been called light verse and not taken seriously. So, Mr. Wallace gives us the following classification which I'm putting forth, drawing on terms from ancient Greek comedy and adapted terms from Northrop Frye's Anatomy of Criticism. So, he basically talks about three possible speakers or personas in American comic poetry. One, the alazon, represented by the larger-than-life comic persona of Walt Whitman. So the speaker in the alazon vein is the protagonist who exaggerates, who always exaggerates to drive the point home, compared to a Kentucky backwoodsman kind of loud-talking, cosmic self kind of figure. So that is the first possibility. The second is the Aaron, represented well by the minimalist, self-deprecating ironist such as Emily Dickinson. So the speaker of the second type will do the very opposite of what the first does. That is, use understatement to drive the comic at times point home. Now, there is one more possibility according to Wallace, and that is the minstrel. Drawing on the minstrel tradition in American culture, the speaker of a minstrel poem uses a tone mixing sorrow, nonsense, and the grotesque. some minstrel examples given by Wallace include E.E. Cummings, who was really funny in many of his poems, and most notably John Berryman of his Dream Songs, where he would employ one of the three major personas depending on each of the songs, of himself, Mr. Bones, or of Henry. So, and methods of the American poet might be boiled down to one of the three. So satire, the larger method, irony, more related to the figure of speech level, and parody, the realm of people who allude to previous poems, making fun of the form of the content of previously written, well-known poems. Okay, so I'm moving forward to 1950s, I believe, and the next slide is the Goosefish poem by Howard Nemeroff, an academic formalist of the 1950s who wrote formal, intelligent, ironic, satirical poems. So, the Goosefish, it draws on the potentially corny theme of lovers on the beach, as of course the Matthew Arnold Dover Beach possibility. It was a slip because Anthony Hecht, a contemporary of Nemeroff's, has a Dover Beach parody of Arnold's. But back to Nemiroff. So, two lovers, and what happens next? They stumble upon the dead body of the goosefish, a deep sea fish which is rather ugly, not very nice, which disrupts the lovemaking to be on the scene. Now, so the situation is made doubly ridiculous by the introduction of the goosefish figure or character who assumes the role of arbiter of the lover's future actions. Let's see, who becomes that rigid optimist. This is not the last stanza. In the final stanza of the Goosefish poem, the Goosefish actually becomes the patriarch of the lovers, dreadfully mild in the half dark. So you see, Nemeroff treats a subject like love on the beach with that degree of ironic undercutting. Allen Ginsberg, whose name of course was mentioned in the morning by Professor Yashab, he too produced a lot of funny poems, such as Portions of America, which at least, why is it funny? Because the speaker assumes the outrageous mad prophet kind of stance, and when you, which I don't have the time to do so, but when you play the audio, yes, the American audience says keep laughing throughout hearing this poem. So there are many funny passages, and you can see it's the sort of just a mad prophet speaking. One, he's the Whitmanian cosmic self who embraces all aspects of Cold War politics of the 50s, but two, he's also the ironic self-deprecator who keeps undermining the seriousness of his diatribe against the evils of American capitalism, Cold War politics, and so on. America, this is quite serious. America, this is the impression I get from looking at in the television set. America, is this correct? I better get down to the job, and so on. Putting my clear shoulder to the wheel. These are the closing lines. Now, a luminous case of the poem as parody is Kenneth Cope's Variations on a Theme by William Carlos Williams, which of course requires the reader's previous knowledge of the original, which is the This Is Just to Say poem, the little piece by Carlos Williams. So, the format of the original is preserved in all four variations, music-like, of which, let's see, we laughed at the hollyhocks together and then I sprayed them with lye. Forgive me, I simply do not know what I'm doing. Or else the last one, last evening we went dancing and I broke your leg. Forgive me, I was clumsy and I wanted you here in the wards where I am the doctor. The doctor, of course, Williams was the medical doctor himself. So, a parody of. Now, moving on. David Ignatov, one of the more notable Jewish American poets of the last half century, has a nice poem about a little thing, the bagel, which one eats for lunch or something. So, as you see, the speaker carries a bagel. I stop to pick up the bagel, rolling away in the wind. Gradually, in the process of trying to pick it up, the speaker becomes at one with the bagel rolling down the street. So, as you see, probably the seriousness of merging with the natural world, with the landscape, which poets in the transcendentalist way will try to do. This is less than serious, merging with the bagel, rolling away from the poet, trying to escape. So, strangely happy with myself. The minstrel poem example, one of the more famous dream songs by Berman, coming up next, number 14. So you see the ironic tone, life, friends, is boring, we must not say so, after all, and so on and so forth. So the speaker is really this mixture of cynical commentator on the boring elements of life, but also somebody who still, however much he fights against that, thinks that life and great literature is, for some reasons, still important. There are, of course, trademark Berman elements, the interesting rhyming, the very strange syntax, and the linguistic experiment, and somehow a dog has taken itself and its tail considerably away, so the language really works wonders in these lines of the last stanza. So, dream songs, several hundred poems of the minstrel identity of the speaker. Very, very interesting. So, I move to a 1990s figure, Tony Hoagland, who is one of the more humorous recent poets, and the poem which I list is called after the first album of the Jimi Hendrix Experience, and as you see it somehow undercuts the whole seriousness of, you all have talked to Americans whose big moments in life are related to the time when JFK was shot, what it was I was doing, or the one time I saw Ray Charles live, or the one time I saw Jimi Hendrix perform live. So, a kind of elite club by 1990s. So you see the whole seriousness of the speaker trying to give you a testimony of him having been to a Hendrix concert, which can be bought for money ever after. So his memory is something less than glorious, of course. He was in the parking lot of the rock festival trying to get away from the noise and looking for my car because I wanted something familiar to throw up next to. So, connections to the kind of psychedelic rock of Jimi Hendrix, which he played. So, of the pills I had swallowed several hundred years before, pills that had answered so many of my questions, says the Hoagland speaker. So, obviously, the vision has not come, only the medical side effects did. And the mention of microscopic Sistine Chapels, the top of European great fine art history, with room for everyone inside. But this is all a failed vision of the hallucinating speaker of the poem. And I was out on the perimeter of history, he goes on, unable to recall the kind and color of the car I owned, and so on. So, with the passage of time, as you see, as the poet admits by the end, the embarrassing experience of the Jimi Hendrix concert attendance would itself become a kind of credential nonetheless, having been there. however inglorious that experience might be. Okay, I move on, and maybe just one or two other quotes from the 1990s major long epic poem by Campbell McGrath called the Bughoe Poem, which was a 70-plus page long epic image of Chicago, of several other things, such as a diatribe against American capitalism, consumerism, and chance has it contains a lot of funny passages as well. So I give two examples of the poet becoming metaphorical about cliches associated with New York, Chicago. Quote, "If New York is an apple, Chicago is pure sausage." Another quote, "Chicago is a great ape house gone bananas, a Hanseatic citadel in hog heaven, a mercantile carnation pinned to the lake's label, a magic hat from which the rabbit of capitalist pull, a portal into the realm of money itself." This is from the second of the total of 6 parts of the poem which deals with the city of Chicago and its culture, industrial and commercial history. So, these were some selections from the 50s through 1990s, poets, poems who, of course, cannot be labeled performance or slam poets by any means, but hopefully it's made some sense that their work is of comic nature and it's not light verse of the Dorothy Parker or Ogden Nash type. Maybe just unrelated, the very last poem, 2 minutes, okay. The very last poem I was going to quote from, it's not on the board, unfortunately, is perhaps the most hilarious poem I was able to locate. It's by Kenneth Coe, whose variation you have already seen, and it's called Fresh Air. It's a poem which satirizes a poetry conference frequented by poets and attended by poets and poetry scholars. So, quote, "At the Poem Society, a black-haired man stands up to say, 'You make me sick with all your talk about restraint and mature talent,' and so on. A blunt man stands up and says, 'He is right. Why should we be organized to defend the kingdom of dullness? There are so many slimy people connected with poetry, too, and people who know nothing about it.'" So, the characters of several hair-colored people stand up and speak, insulting the scholars as well as poets present, and then finally the mythic figure, the strangler who's after strangling some bad poets, comes to the scene. And the very last section of Fresh Air, which was, by the way, published early on in the Donald Allen New American Poetry Anthology 1945-1960, which introduced the Beats, the San Francisco people, the Black Mountain people, among other things, to a larger audience. So the last section of Fresh Air by Coke is really a hilarious extended parody on Walt Whitman, containing lines, quote, "Bang, I give in. I see already my name in 2 or 3 anthologies. A serving girl comes into the barn, bringing me the anthologies. She is very pretty, and I smile at her a little sadly. Perhaps it is my last smile. Perhaps she will hit me. But no, she smiles in return, and she takes my hand." So, anyway, sort of Whitmanesque, long previous lines. Okay, so to conclude, poetry, American poetry, I found it to be highly comic. Of course, the Whitman being comic may be questionable, but everybody else, from Dickinson onwards, seems to have been. And it's not like this. Ogden Nash. Easy. So, thank you.
Our next and final speaker is Mel Cannon. Is Mel here? Mel is both a poet and a translator. And he's taught American literature at the University Kadir-Has in Istanbul. And he's published 3 books of poetry. And his most recent one was last year, published by Newsfly Press in 2011 entitled Tape. He has also been the co-translator of 2 novels from Turkish, and his own work has appeared in bilingual translation in English and Turkish in Turkey. Now he's going to be talking about translation as a phenomenon of modernist and postmodernist American poetry, with particular emphasis on the New York school. We've already heard mention of Kent Coke. We'll be dealing with that book along with John Ashbery and other members of the New York school. So,
thank you. That's a wonderful poem by Kenneth Coke, Fresh Air. I'm going to let in some fresh light, I think, so I'll be able to read. Figure out how to work this. It's a little dark up here. That's fine. That's good. Yeah, thank you. Well, as a Southerner, it's given me a lot of pleasure to hear so much about Southern poetry today, and I feel a little bit like a traitor because I'm going to be focusing on a Yankee poet from upstate New York, John Ashbery, and a European intellectual, Walter Benjamin, in this paper. So, onward through the book. In an often misquoted statement, John Ashbery averred famously in a 1972 Art News interview that to create a work of art that the critic cannot even talk about ought to be the artist's chief concern. This quote has often been paraphrased by critics to indicate that Ashbery wished only for his own poetry to be immune to critical interpretation, whereas the statement apparently expresses the poet's view towards works of art in general. What makes his statement even more interesting when viewed from retrospective about 40 years is that to a large degree he himself succeeded in creating a kind of poetry that defies any sort of definitive critical interpretation by playing form against content in such a way that any sense of intention created in the poem appears to be undercut continually by an equal and opposite reaction against intention or objective. This simultaneity of construction and deconstruction of poetic logic suggests a movement towards a kind of lyrical purity pursued by symbolist poets and described by Walter Benjamin in his discussion of the function of translation and the task of the translator, an introduction to his translation of Baudelaire's Tableau Parisien as pure language, which no longer means or expresses anything, but is as expressionless and creative word, that which is meant in all languages, so that all communication, all meaning, and all intention arrive at a level where they are destined to be extinguished. This statement seems also to express Ashbery's artistic ideal of purity that would render a work of art inviolable and exempt from anything so banal as critical interpretation. To understand more fully the link between Benjamin's entre-guerre ideas about translation and Ashbery's postmodernist poetics requires an examination of the source of Benjamin's ideas and how these ideas came to bear on issues that led to the development of modernist poetics near the turn of the 20th century. In his essay, Benjamin acts not only as a translator, but as a latter-day spokesman for the symbolists of the mid to late 19th century by articulating the nuances of the symbolist creed and mode of writing. By beginning his essay with a statement that no work of art is created for the observer or reader, and then going on to assert that the intention of the work of art is neither to make a statement nor to communicate a message, he is setting up his argument for the existence of a pure language, which justifies the idea that a work of art may exist for no other reason than to intimate an essence that can never be grasped in human language, but only sensed through the most abstruse and subtle devices of the poet or artist in creating the work. The poet's poet of the symbolist movement in 19th century France, Stéphane Mallarmé, defines the artist's task as a form of translation when he speaks of the modern work of art as a symphony, which, according to the intention or unbeknownst to the musician, approaches thought, which no longer claims descent from common speech. For within it, he says, some explosion of mystery to the skies and its impersonal magnificence occurred, where the orchestra couldn't not influence the ancient effort that long claimed to translate it uniquely through the voice of the ancestor. When Benjamin asserts that the translation's language can, indeed must, free itself from the bondage of meaning in order to allow its true mode of intentio to resound, not as the intention to reproduce, but rather as harmony, as a complement to its language, in which language, this is, I think, important, and he says, in which language communicates itself. His statement can be seen in simplest terms as applying to the composition of the original as well as to a translation of it. According to Benjamin's literary criticism, couched in his definition of the function of translation, the aim of the poet is not to produce meaning, but to allow the language to speak for itself through the intrinsic formal and linguistic qualities of the poem. That is, the poem's form is a corollary to logos. It is what Mallarmé describes as the flower that is absent from every bouquet. And from it is born the poem's content. In his essay, Benjamin even uses the Greek beginning sentence of Genesis. In arche en ho logos, or in the beginning was the word. These ideas are drawn in part from Benjamin's study of the writings of the 16th century Kabbalist, Isaac Lurie. Sorry, the theory gets a little strange here. It's related to the Kabbalah. But it's an intrinsic part of Benjamin's essay. According to Lurie, God's first act was to withdraw or to contract his essence to allow room for the operations of human will, free will. In this void left by God, human language finds life in the form of exile from the greater or purer language of the Messianic age. And it is here that translation, as a means of interpreting the relationship between languages and of a specific language to the concept of a pure language, necessarily finds its home. Benjamin infers in his essay that exile itself, as a condition of life and as a metaphysical concept relating to pure language, lies at the basis of any new form of poetics, as is illustrated in his essay by another Lurian idea, that of the shattering of the vessels. I think I need to stop for a moment here, say something about the shattering of the vessels. The shatter is, as we know, as scholars of American poetry, we know that fragmentation is very important in modernist verse, the development of modernist verse, the use of fragments. And this is related to that. According to Lurie, the pure light of God emanating from the eyes of primordial man was stored in vessels, some of which were unable to withstand the pressure and shattered, scattering fragments throughout empty space. While most of the light returned to God, other sparks adhered to the shards of the vessel, from which were produced husks, wherein the remaining sparks remained trapped. And these represent evil and the material world. The task of the first man, Adam, was to gather up the sparks and through contemplative exercises to reintegrate them, thereby restoring the lost purity and perfection through repair of the vessels. Adam and Eve's transgression disrupted this task, causing all that had been gained to be lost. And with their fall, all the sparks of human souls contained in Adam's own soul fell as well. As a result, humans participate in the never-ending process of repairing the vessels through contemplative action and acts of devotion, expressed as raising up the fallen sparks. It is to this process that Benjamin refers when he says, speaking of the main task of translation. Just as fragments of a vessel, in order to be fitted together, must correspond to each other in the tiniest details, but need not resemble each other, so translation, instead of making itself resemble the meaning of the original, must lovingly and in detail fashion in its own language a counterpart to the original's mode of intention, in order to make both of them recognizable as fragments of a vessel, as fragments of a greater language. So what he's talking about is a pure language, a language that cannot come from an original, the original that's being translated or the translation, but the two combined. In terms of this analogy, the task of the translator in recreating the original, not as a facsimile, but as a counterpart to its mode of intention, is to reveal both the original and the translation of it as being made up of fragments of an idea that intimate the existence of something whole that can exist in neither the original nor the translation. According to Benjamin, in performing this task, the translator elevates language to a higher level by interacting with the original text in such a way that he breaks through the rotten barriers of his own language to extinguish that which is no longer current in it, and at the same time to give it new currency in the reinvented text of the translation. To a large degree, Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot created a new poetics by translating older texts, or fragments of them, into a contemporary mode of intention, to use Benjamin's term. And in terms of Benjamin's Lurianic theory, they were engaged in a contemplative ritual aimed at fitting back into place the shattered pieces of the vessels God created to hold his light after his withdrawal into the empyrean of pure language. To a very large extent, the wasteland comprises the echoed lines of other texts, and its tone or mode of intention echoes that of Eliot's symbolist mentor, Jules Lefort. We may also remember that Pound's life work, The Cantos, begins with Pound's retranslation into English of a Latin translation of a passage from the Odyssey, published by the Renaissance scholar Andreas Divas in 1537. And the great parts of this monumental work are made up of translations from Greek, Latin, and Chinese texts. At the same time, Eliot's extensive use of fragments from ancient and modern texts in Greek, Latin, French, and German, either translated or in the original language, creates a metatext expressing the cultural crises of the post-World War I era. Is there any water? While in their voluntary exile in England, Eliot and Pound directed in their own task largely through the poetry and critical writings of another exile who had been intensely involved in a change in the poetics of his day, and whose works illustrate Benjamin's ideas relating to the quest of a pure language. In their attempts to modernize and renovate poetic language, to make it new, Pound and Eliot took their cue from the medieval poet Dante Alighieri and his poetic trek toward the Empyrean and the culmination of spiritual perfection in the multifold of rose. As did Virgil and Beatrice for Dante, so did Dante take on the role of spirit and spiritual guide. Thank you. So did Dante take on the role of spirit and spiritual guide for Pound and Eliot, who incorporated his themes and imagery into their work as an authoritative means of defining their own critical and artistic concerns. While the focus of Pound in his attempt to renovate poetry in English did not involve such a radical change as the move from Latin to vernacular Italian, it did initiate a movement away from established verse forms, metrics, and figures of speech that he viewed as moribund, and toward a more natural form of speech, based not on regular metrics but on the musical phrase as it arose from the concision of the poem's linguistic ideation. Inspired by Dante's renewal of Italian poetics and the Divine Comedy, which Pound felt came about as a result of 2 centuries of development in Provence and 1 in Tuscany, and through his own intense reading, writing, translating, and reading translations of the troubadour poets, as well as the poets of the Romantic and Symbolist movements in France, in his own generation and the generation immediately preceding his, Pound had already in his 20s envisioned the future of 20th century poetry, which, he says, will be as much like granite as it can be. Its force will lie in truth, its interpretive power. I mean, it will not try to seem forcible by rhetorical din and luxurious riot. We will have fewer painted adjectives impeding the shock and stroke of it. At least for myself, I want it so. Austere, direct, free from emotional slither. Love that phrase, emotional slither. This stripping down of poetic language to its essence suggests Pound's approach to the Dantean and symbolist ideal of elevating language to a higher level of purity. French symbolism, as it was viewed by Benjamin and Mallarmé, lost much of its force in the modernist poetics of Pound and Eliot, when on the one hand, in 1913, Pound repudiated it as a relevant dynamic in modern poetry, saying of symbolists in a letter, they beget imitation, and one can learn nothing from it. And in another letter in 1914, there's nothing to be studied about symbolism. And on the other hand, when Eliot, who although he continued to be strongly influenced by Mallarmé, right up to and through this writing of his first major work, 4 quartets, began to employ his symbolist aesthetic in the service of Christianity, and he became a member of the Church of England in 1927. European movements spawned by symbolism, such as Dadaism and Surrealism, had little effect on American poetics during and in the wake of the bombastic political polemic of Pound and the quasi-religious councils of Eliot on the state of poetry and civilization. Not, that is, until the mid-20th century and the arrival on the scene of the group of New York poets who saw modernist American poetics as having reached a dead end, at least for them. This group of poets, whose most well-known figures include John Ashbery, Frank O'Hara, Kenneth Cope, James Schuyler, and Barbara Guest, took up where the fin de siècle American symbolism and decadent poets left off, turning back toward Europe and European poetry in their search for an alternative both to the academic poetry spawned by Eliot and to its nemesis and antithesis, the poetry of the beats. Oh my God, I'm not going to finish this. Well, let's see. I'll skip over here. Before Ashbery went to Paris on a Fulbright grant in 1955, Kenneth Cope had introduced him to the work of Raymond Roussel, who was known to a small circle of admirers and writers for the experimental poems and novels he left behind when he died in 1933 from an overdose of barbiturates. Rather than go into great detail to explain Roussel's experimental techniques, a quote from poet Christopher Sawyer Lozano from his book, The Continual Pilgrimage, about American expatriates in Paris, should be sufficient for present purposes. In Roussel, associations between one idea or event and another are based not on external reality, but on a highly permutated verbal construct in which two words nearly identical homophonically are combined with each with other like phrases to yield phonetically similar sentences with entirely different meanings. The strongest influence from Roussel in Ashbery's early books can be seen in the tennis court. Well, I'm going to skip over some of this stuff, in which he uses collage techniques. He creates a poetry that's based on irrational collections of words in sort of a collage format. And so what he's really doing in the 1950s in his poetry is what Benjamin had described in 1923 as the task of the translator, or the task of the poet as well, by starting not with content but with form, or linguistic formations, to elevate the language of the poem to a level that more closely approximates a pure language. Sawyer Lozano quotes Ashbery as saying that what he found most appealing in Roussel was Roussel's ability to manipulate language to raise the word to a new power, to yield true meaning at last. That is, the lead which alchemy is on the verge of translating something far more interesting than gold. So, what we see in Ashbery's poetry and that of his poet friends in New York City is the coming of age of America, or an American poetics of a poetry based largely on symbolism, as well as a new way of viewing the relationship between poetry and translation, vis-a-vis Walter Benjamin's critical concepts and the task of the translator. American poetics, as it's developed through Ashbery, O'Hara, Koch, and others of what have become known as the New York School, is, as we see presaged in Benjamin's essay, a poetry that has drawn so near translation that the original language and the language of translation are virtually one and the same language that is elevated or translated to a higher level. As Benjamin says near the end of his essay, true translation is transparent. It does not obscure the original, does not stand in its light, but rather allows pure language, as if strengthened by its own medium, to shine even more fully on the original. This is made possible above all by conveying the syntax word for word, and this demonstrates that the word, not the sentence, is the original element of translation. For the sentence is the wall in front of the language of the original, and word for word rendering is the archaic. If we apply this concept to the poetry written by what David Lehman has called the last avant-garde, we can see more clearly how Ashbery and company have managed the language in their poetry so that the artifice of their language is portrayed so clearly as artifice, or as formal linguistic constructions that often seem to have no meaning outside themselves, that the original impulse lying behind it is not obscured, but heightened by this intense focus on the words themselves, rather than on any attempt to create an external meaning. Okay, conclusion. Just one more minute. This is the conclusion. Yet because this poetry that reaches so ardently toward an elevated level of expression, a higher form of truth, wasn't written in a conventional way, it can't be read in a conventional way. It has to be read as a translation is read. Yet as a translation of the poet's native tongue, rendered into a form of speech that may appear strange at first. As strange as one's first encounter with any alien form of being, or as strange and yet familiar as an encounter with the other in oneself through the artificial medium of words. Appreciating this new poetics involves adjusting one's perception away from its former mode of associating words and sentences together logically, and toward viewing a poem through the lens of logos, so that, using Benjamin's analogy, one is able to discern through the poet's dissociated sentences, or walls of words, the finely cut facets on the gems on display in the arcade. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mel, and thanks to all four speakers for being so good about keeping an eye on time. We have some time now for questions to any of the speakers. I can kick off then. I was wondering, when you introduced Benjamin to the discussion of translation of the New York School of Poets, do you think that those poets have Benjamin in mind, or have they any contact or knowledge of his theories?
Well, no, that's the thing that most interested me, because he wrote the essay in 1923, and what he was really doing, I think, is projecting forward up to the postmodern sort of poetics that Ashbery and his group were involved in. So he was, in a sense, predicting the future in a kind of through linguistic theory. His own linguistic theory related to translation. So that translation, as he was, the point that I was trying to make, I don't know if I came across that clearly, is that what Ashbery and the New York poets, well, Ashbery in particular, are doing is to translate their own language in a sense. So that's why translating is such an important part of what's happening now, I think, in American poetry.
Yeah, Mel?
Maybe you said that the Ashbery's poetry has to be read as a translation. And can you explain on what how do we read translation?
Okay.
How do we know that we read?
All right. Well, Benjamin's point is that poetry is not nor translation. Neither poetry nor translation have the function of communicating meaning. That meaning it comes about through linguistic constructions, formal linguistic constructions, right? So that in translation, one doesn't think about what the poet is thinking about in writing the poem, right? The translator is not concerned with the kind of meaning that the poet is concerned with in writing the poem. Huh? No, not really.
No.
The poet is concerned with the form, the linguistics, logos. I mean, this is the tricky part of the concept, is that logos relates to the formal quality of the poem. So what I think Ashbery is doing to sort of extinguish meaning by playing form against content is that he's focusing strictly on the form, on formal qualities, formal linguistic qualities of the language. Does that help?
I still don't know how we read the translation. How do we read the translation?
Well, how do you read Ashbery? Ashbery is difficult. Isn't he difficult? Well, the thing that I think would make him less difficult is to read through any sort of attempt to create some sort of meaning, a message, and to read the language simply for what it is, which somebody earlier said related to another semiotics person is saying, well, you don't, in poetry, the important thing is not a message, but the way words are put together, the form. So Ashbery is taking that, I think, to an extreme. That's my point of view.
This question here from Morgan.
My question is Julie Fletcher. I really enjoyed your taxonomy, light versus serious comic verse, and I wonder, do you think the resistance to, or the lack of a methodology for talking about critically serious comic verse, is that a phenomenon for American poetry in general, or do you think poetry in general?
You mean when the critics of poetry
Yeah,
think it's only light verse or nothing?
exactly.
They seem to have done that. This study from 1984 is just one of maybe 3 or 4 20th century studies of the comic in American poetry. So even large volumes on America's humor cover everything, fiction, drama, but poetry is supposed to be light verse or serious, and the serious, of course, it was said also in the morning, there have been all these diatribes against who killed poetry, and poetry being dead, having been dead since the 1930s, according to some of the non-poetry people, critics, and so on. So,
And do you think, I mean, is there a similar, has there been a similar oversight in terms of European poetries? Is there, do people talk about serious comic poetry in Czech poetry?
good question, I wonder.
Yeah.
We have other specialists in Europe and India.
But nobody will mention Ogden Nash or Dorothy Parker if they're making a list of major American poets in the 20th century. They would be footnotes. Whereas I think this is an interesting case at the moment of a poet who perhaps now can be considered American, Paul Muldoon, who just plays games all the time in a very Ogden Nash-like way. But he writes about serious things, and they're serious poems, and they're taken seriously, but they seem to be they're very playful as well. So maybe that's a healthy blurring of the boundaries.
I don't know. I mean, I just remember that I was involved in translating Ashbery with Yaroslav, and of course it was very difficult. It was very but I wouldn't say that we reinvented what he did. We still interpreted what he did, which means you do not expect message from there. But this does not mean that we cannot expect meaning.
Well, I don't believe that.
Well, just one more thing. So how do you imagine a situation? You meet a person and we shake hands and say, "Shall we speak pure language?"
Well, I think what Benjamin is talking about is the meaning that is the most meaningful ideas or feelings or whatever that come out of a poem. Do that without the poet's conscious intention that they.
We have difficulties with John Ashbery. This is one thing, however. Then we were at the conference, and we met in Poland, as a matter of fact, a year ago. And when we started speaking about Czech music, because he is interested in very peculiar Czech composers that nobody knows much about, but he does, and he studies them. So another sort of typical feature of Ashbery. But then he read his poetry, and it opened up. It was clear.
Yeah.
We had no problems. I only prayed so that I remember what I remembered. What I heard, before I get home and read my, as you said, reinvented sort of poem. But I still think that, yes, indeed, I mean, sometimes there are moments when we have to reinvent sort of what the feeling that we got from it, Those are the meaning. The meaning is not gone.
I know exactly what you're saying, and I agree with you, but what makes Ashbery's poetry what it is? What makes it different? What makes it so unusual for so many people? How has it changed poetry? He has changed poetry.
This is exactly what you say. This is very unusual sort of words and images being put next to each other, juxtaposed, etc., right?
But hasn't he reinvented poetry in a sense for whatever he's doing? I mean, what makes his poetry so special? If he is not actually...
Well, his mind and his originality, his vision of the world, which still is reflected in the poetry. O'Hara was a little bit more simple, let's say.
Exactly.
I mean, using sort of also ready-made, I would say, images or whole sentences or so, and putting them together.
Some of his poetry is like that, but other of his poetry is very much like Ashbery's. When you read it, it seems to make no sense until you read it in a certain way. I mean, O'Hara went both ways. He could be very clear and direct.
If it makes sense in a certain way, so read it in a certain way.
Well, if you can do that, the reason that I got it, I'm sorry.
Well, it doesn't relate maybe to the Ashbery presentation, but to Ashbery's models. I've always wondered, I heard some 20 years ago or 15, a professor claim that Ashbery himself was asked about any reference to Gertrude Stein or any influence of Gertrude Stein upon his experimental work. And he supposedly said, no influence, never has been, never will be. But the more, every time I happen to teach a piece by Stein in class, I see a lot of common ground. So Stein was an early pioneer of what Ashbery and others did.
Well, this is something that I had to cut out, you know.
Yeah.
I ran out of time. That Gertrude Stein was trying to create a Cubist poetry of her
She
time.
did the crazy things with meaning.
Exactly, and it was Cubism was at that time the artistic rage, you know. But when Ashbery and the New York poets were involved in abstract expressionism, and I think that their poetry is very, very strongly influenced by that. Personally, sorry.
If there are no further questions, we wind it up. And thank you once again to the 4 speakers.